In this video, we'll discover uncontrolled form components and the role of refs. We'll specifically use the createRef method for working with uncontrolled form components. Let's begin. In the last video, we saw controlled form components. The basic idea behind controlled form components is that your data resides in the state and your form elements push data into the state as well as pull from it in real time. One of the benefits of controlled components is the ability to implement in-place effects like validation and formatting, which respond as the user types in. But there are situations where you may not need a controlled component. If you're only looking to access data once, such as when submitting a form, then you can also implement uncontrolled form components. An uncontrolled form component is simply a component which is not controlled by React. It is a regular form element that is rendered and controlled by the DOM. This kind of a relationship is typically one way, where React accesses the DOM version of the form element to access and retrieve data when needed. Uncontrolled form components are thus great for simple use cases where we don't want React to set values to form elements. Let's rebuild the example we worked with in the last video and implement uncontrolled elements this time. So go ahead, download and set up the project starter files as always. This is almost the same application that we worked with in the previous video. There are some differences though. First up, the message box component here is a class component. You can, however, implement uncontrolled form components in both class and function components easily using the process shown in this example. The second change is the presence of a submit button, which needs to be pressed to submit the data in the form. We need this to be able to fetch data from the form elements manually from the DOM, instead of using an event listener and synthetic events. As usual, our state variables are present and ready to hold the data from the form. And our submit button is wired to execute the submit form function which we'll build here. Now, to be able to access DOM nodes once React renders them, we'll use a feature called references or refs in short. First up, we'll have to create a reference before we can attach it to a form element. To achieve this, we'll import the createRef function from the React library like so. Then, we'll create 3 ref variables, one each for our form elements. Once we have these 3 refs, we'll attach them to our form elements. Since we have a class component here, we'll have to use this .ref name to access and bind the ref to the form components. By doing this, when this component renders, React creates a reference, a sort of a direct line to the DOM node representing the form element. In the submit form function, I'll now use the this.setState function to populate our state variables with data from the form. For the name property, I'll use the sentence case function, and to access the value of the input field, I'll use this.nameref.current.value. When using refs, the DOM node and its API are accessible using this.refname.current. That is how we are able to access the value of the input element here. Likewise, I'll also fetch values from the select element and the text area nodes respectively. Let's test this now. I'll fill up the form, press the submit button, and we have our data. Refs are great when you want to reach out into the DOM and access a node directly. Besides letting you play with form elements, refs are great for integrating non-React JavaScript libraries. For instance, this next example shows you how to integrate the chart.js library for building a React component that renders a line graph easily. Grab the project archive from this link and set it up. Our quintessential app component here renders a div container which needs to hold a chart. The data for the chart is available as an array of X and Y data points that represent maximum temperature conditions for a week. I've already included the chart.js library in the package.json file so that it is downloaded and ready for use when you run npm install at the beginning. I'll begin by creating a component named chart component, which will act like a wrapper on the chart.js library and allow us to integrate a line chart in our apps. In addition to React, we'll also import chart.js like so. Then I'll create a function component named chart component, which brings in three props, namely data, width, and height. This component renders an HTML5 canvas element, which will be used to render the chart by the chart.js library. The width and height props will thus be used to set the width and height of the canvas element so that it is customizable. Then I'll create a reference to this canvas element using the createRef function, and we'll attach it to the canvas element in the render. At this point, we need to run a function when this component is mounted, which uses the chart.js library to render the chart on our canvas. In a class component, you can use the component.didMount lifecycle function for this purpose. Since this is a function component, we'll use the useEffect hook function to achieve the same result. Inside the useEffect function, I'll first create a constant named ctx, which will be used to grab a handle to the canvas element once it is rendered in the DOM. This is available using canvasRef.current. Then we can simply create a new instance of the chart constructor function, passing in this reference to the canvas element. I'll then use standard boilerplate code from the chart.js documentation to render a line chart where the labels are derived from the x property, from the weather data array, and the data points are derived from the y property. We'll also set the background color to a pale red with a red border and a few other options. I'll export this out. And back in the app component, we'll import this component in, and we'll render an instance in the container div, passing in the weather data array and a fixed width and height value. That's it. We can now see the chart.js library in action right within a React component. Though refs can be used for accessing the DOM directly, extensive usage of this feature should be avoided. Having said that, there are legitimate reasons for using the refs, two of which you saw in this video. In the next video, we'll take a look at techniques for optimizing form elements in a React component.